of course, Michael, you have been one of our earliest supporters.
Indeed.
You've been involved in framing our syllabus, and of course, a lot of our students are here who will be keen to listen to you.
That's terrific. Yeah, it's very impressive how the school has evolved in recent months. Really quite remarkable, I have to say.
And we still have that MOU to sign.
Yes.
We've been discussing it all this time, but not putting ink to paper.
Yes, this is true. That's a good reminder there.
Yeah, Michael, I've just got a call, so I'm assuming Professor Patel will join us anytime soon, and then we'll start.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
How's the COVID situation, Michael, there in the US?
Sorry, what was that?
How's the COVID situation there in the US?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the state. I mean, some states, including the one I'm in, had a pretty bad surge over the last few weeks, but we're starting to see some improvements. But then there are other states that are starting to see things get rough again. But I think it's similar to India, like a lot of high number of cases, but fortunately, to this point, hospitalization rates are relatively low compared to previously. But I unfortunately, I know a number of people who are fully vaccinated, have boosters, and still got really sick. So it's just hard to predict.
Yeah.
But yeah, fortunately, it's not as serious as the last surge last year, which is good.
I think the major difference is the fact that we've vaccinated. So I suppose that's reduced the casualties.
Yes, exactly. This is true.
Hello. So we've now had Professor Patel also join us, and I think it's good to now go. So once again, I want to thank and welcome each and every one of you to what we call the Lavard Confab on National Security. This was actually envisioned by our Vice Chancellor, Professor Patel, and the idea was that the School of International Cooperation, Security and Strategic Languages will initiate this flagship lecture series, and the conversations will revolve around issues that is relevant to the major focus areas of the school, that is on international relations and internal security, political economy, and of course also on strategic languages that have implications for national security. The series is endeavoring to bring together eminent personalities, including policymakers in government, opinion influencers from the wider strategic community, to provide a varied perspective, thereby adding to the existing discourse on the subject. The series will also act as a platform for our students who are here in large numbers from different areas of specialization to interact with one another, thereby enabling a multidisciplinary inquiry into research at the university. We are, of course, at the end of the semester. For those of you who have joined us outside RRU, and we are closing off with what I would say is a blockbuster lineup of 3 back-to-back talks for the benefit of our students and the larger Rashtriya Raksha University community, which has been actually participating enthusiastically in all the lectures this far arranged over the last few months. It gives me immense pleasure, of course, to introduce the chair for this particular session, Professor Patel, who is has been the Vice Chancellor of the university since early 2020. Prior to that, of course, he spent nearly a decade as a Vice Chancellor of the Gujarat National Law University. Professor Patel is well known as an international civil servant, and especially for his work on international law. But I think a lesser known fact is his expertise in international relations and national security. He's always taken very keen interest, and a lot of the things, Michael, that we were discussing just before Sir joined was actually envisioned by him. And we've just been trying to implement a lot of the ideas that he's given us over the last year. And you've been very closely involved with us. And you've actually seen the trajectory that we have taken. Professor Patel is, of course, now a member of the National Security Advisory Board of India. And I think for those, again, who've joined us from outside, they'll be very happy to know that Sir has also been elected now as a member of the International Law Tribunal from 2023 to 2027. So with those words, I would warmly welcome our chair, Professor Patel, and I would request you, sir, to maybe set the context by just some of your opening comments before Michael takes over, and I'll introduce Michael, of course. Sir.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Venkateswaran for organizing this lecture series. And I warmly welcome your friend Michael to this, in the words of Dr. Venkat, blockbuster series, how big powers are managing their national security apparatus. I also congratulate Dr. Venkateswaran and the school for organizing this lecture series, because this kind of continuous deliberation, continuous thinking not only provides vital input to the policymakers, but creates an enormous amount of interest in the student community. And in this way, RRU fulfills a very critical role of generating cadre of national security personnel who think through the issues and challenges, and also when they grow up and when they enter the profession of national security, they are well aware of the foundations of national security. And therefore, I believe that RRU is able to play a direct role in both helping the policy-making institutions, but also generating the students. And I think this is what the role which, among others, where Michael is also associated with, the best universities in United States have dealt with. Now, today's lecture, of course, is focusing on national security, how US is managing. And I have been privileged to prepare a manuscript on national security of India and international law, which was much more legal analysis of national security aspects. But I'm a very keen student of, which Michael must be knowing, John Norton Moore, because whenever I meet him, whenever I talk to him, I find his profound thinking. Of course, he's much more focused on law of the sea, but national security as a whole, because he was the pioneer, if we can recognize, back in 1980, his book, National Security Law and Policy, not only became the standard trendsetter among all law schools, but even the State Department, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, all of them have been embracing the thought processes which John has been able to bring out a number of editions. And as a student of John, though we are away thousands of kilometers, I do keep reading his thoughts, and I do remain inspired. And as a head of this university, a pioneering university, it is also my humble tribute to my professor. How the lessons which we learn from the professors in our respective fields, we pay them back, and how we generate the interest among the students, but also the academic institutions. So this is how I would like to set the tone of my address. But let me go to the few remarks on the national security of the US itself. In my view, the national security of United States, even though it has attained, it will continue to remain the central focus for the entire century of all policymaking institutions and scholarly endeavors. As the world is embracing multipolar world, in which we may not be able to rule out the ideas of Cold War and the way China is rising gradually but steadfastly. US, the largest economy in the world, the largest standing armed forces, abundance of resources, despite all this, will continue to grapple with enormous amount of internal, external security issues and challenges. Still, its achievements in science and technology, economic growth, and on the other hand, innumerable emerging newer political, social, and also cultural challenges would keep the US national security structure an enigmatic, if I use that word. While the US Constitution remains a force and model to be reckoned with in terms of individual freedoms and duty charter, as we all know, its ability to preserve the national security and promoting the foreign policy objectives remain under significant stress. And the stress is being seen. The current episodes across the globe, one can see how US policymakers, but also the lawmakers, are grappling with these twin challenges. And would US be able to continue to do the same when, for example, China would have risen to a disproportionate level than what it is today? Now, this requires a very significant thinking on part of the national security thinkers. When we read the policy papers and research carried out by some of the leading American and even foreign universities and institutions, they will continue to carry out this interdisciplinary scholarship. Again, going back to what John has been doing, the interdisciplinary approaches to national security will be more and more forthcoming as far as the national security management of US is concerned. In fact, the national security structure of USA would be calling more soft security research than so far the military. The US federal government, as well as various states, have significantly influenced and shaped the ability of the executive branch to foster the national security objectives. Like India, the US Federation and democracy, under the rubric of, we can say, competitive federalism, cooperative federalism, have been and will continue to undergo metamorphic changes in terms of defining and upholding the national security objectives. The federal structure itself, one can say, and particularly during this last 4 years of Republican administration, how the federal structure itself has been a part of the challenge and also a part of solution when we are talking the external security threats and challenges which United States is facing. So as the US Federation, continues to overcome challenges. The spectrum of national security has grown from issues which define the post 9/11 tragedy to the challenges, climate change, cybersecurity, you can just name. Now, these issues need to be studied against the backdrop of history under both the sets of administration, Republican as well as Democratic, and also the political strategy context in which US will be able to grow, let's say by 2050. By that time, even countries like India, China would have been, major economic power, major military power, major. And when we are looking at 2050, how the US national security objectives would come under stress and how US will be able to realign its both national security as well as foreign policy objective definitely remains very interesting subject of study. And that means while these are the objectives, how the management structure will be evolving, the way the national security management structure of India has been evolving significantly under the current government since 2014. I do believe that US would also be looking at Indian model, because I think US, Russia, China, India, these are the countries which will be learning from each other in order to respond to the ever-evolving needs. And therefore, thought processes like this, which are conducted by RRU, for example, will always remain very vital, and it will give you a lot of food for thought. I would be very keen to learn from Michael, particularly how the US is able to manage the delicate balance between the internal and external security objectives, and how these are two agencies, one international security objective and one external security agencies, how they're able to realign, and what are the basically fault lines in the national management, national security management architecture of United States. And maybe you would like to throw some weight, because we in India are facing the same kind of problems, realignment, reconciliation, but also fault lines. So I'm very keen to learn from distinguished colleague Michael on management structure of United States on national security. And I think as we learn more from Russia and China in the days to come, I think the RRU students would have really would have become much more wiser and much more, I would not say wiser, but much more informed to put in proper context how India is going and how India needs to grow. And therefore, this attempt made by Dr. Venkat is absolutely commendable. And I think what the other school is doing, internal security and police administration, which is also doing the similar kind of lecture series in the areas of police image as well as women empowerment in national security. I think these are the kind of thought processes which the universities of kind like RRU are really becoming the role model for several universities, not only in India, but across the globe. So with these remarks, once again, Michael, I welcome you, and I thank my colleague Venkat for all his painstaking efforts. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to listen from you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think you've set the context very beautifully in terms of, I think one of the factors you pointed out is the rise of China itself and how the United States is going to answer that question. What are probably going to be the spheres of influence, whether that is going to expand or is it going to actually reduce for the United States moving forward? I think another important point you touched upon is the fusion between domestic and external factors, and how whether that fusion is going to be strengthened or is that going to be threatened further, especially as the security threat matrix expands with the inclusion of many new non-traditional security challenges that are emerging. So, Michael, I think the context is set. I don't think we need to add anything more. And I think Professor Patel will agree that we can't have a more eminent expert than Michael Kugelman to, speak a little bit. Of course, Michael is very well known across India because he appears quite frequently in the media. And often I feel that although this might appear to be in a lighter vein, but on a more serious note, Michael seems to know more about India than many of us, because he's often speaking about India, and he's often speaking about the United States and what it does in the region in our media. So Michael, of course, to just briefly touch upon his background, is the currently a Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars at Washington, D.C. Michael does a lot of work on what the United States does in South Asia, more specifically on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. He is, an editor or a co-editor of almost a dozen books, writes very frequently in many of the major publications like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, and also is, spent considerable time very early in his career with the US State Department as an intern. Michael, I'm not going to expand any further, but the very fact that he's speaking at about just after 5 a.m. in the morning is a testament to how committed he is to spreading this narrative and to actually contribute to this dialogue. And I can't thank you enough, Michael, for that. And without taking much more time, I now hand over this platform to you. Michael, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Venkat. And I should say good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. Very grateful to my friend, Dr. Venkat, for inviting me to participate in this very distinguished lecture series, given the other distinguished experts that are a part of it. It's quite an honor for me to be a part of it. I also wanted to thank Dr. Patel for his very impressive leadership of the school, and also for his very useful opening comments that he made just a few moments ago, which I think have really set some really good context for this discussion. And I should say that I still have very fond memories. I have a fairly long association with the school there. I believe it was about a year ago, maybe a bit more. I participated as one of the guest speakers in a brief RRU course on the international relations of South Asia, as I recall. And the lecture times were similar to the current one. And it was a great way to start the day for me. Some really great questions and comments from the students and the audience. And I look forward to more of that today. So indeed, the topic of this lecture is how the United States manages national security. It's a very important, though very complicated topic. And I should note that a fully comprehensive and exhaustive explanation of this issue would take many days to elucidate. So I will focus on highlighting what I think are some of the more important and salient aspects of this very broad topic. So just to provide a sense of where I'm going to be going, the roadmap for the presentation will be as follows. I'll first lay out some of the key institutions and influencers of national security management in the U.S. and how they all operate within the three branches of the U.S. government. I'll then discuss a bit how these national security institutions coexist and cooperate. And I'll then sort of shake things up a bit and present three notable case studies in recent U.S. history of U.S. national security management that show in several cases where national security is managed well, and in a few cases where it has been managed badly, and what lessons can be learned from them. They're all case studies that deal with crisis management during security crises. So let's get right to it. And I'll start with the institutional and bureaucratic architecture of U.S. national security management. And I apologize in advance if some of you may hear some things that you already know very well. I know that we've got some very well-informed audience members here, but I think that it's important to underscore some key points, even if they are already somewhat well known. So in the U.S., national security management plays out within the three-tiered government branch system enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. So in order to ensure checks and balances on power, the US government is broken into three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And so let's take the executive branch first. This encompasses, above all, the White House, along with US government agencies. Many of them focus on national security in different ways. They include, above all, the White House itself. And one can argue that the chief manager of US national security is the President of the United States. The President is designated by the US Constitution as the Commander-in-Chief. This ensures what I think is one of the most fundamental principles of US national security management, that the civilian leadership oversees, has supremacy over the military and military leadership. And this is one of the many ways in which US national security management is, quite frankly, similar to that of India. And it's clearly a key hallmark of democracy. So because of this rich tradition of civilian supremacy in the US, there has been controversy when US military leaders have been brought into senior civilian national security positions. And this has happened several times in recent years, including during the Trump administration, and of course very recently with the Biden administration, when the president chose a recently retired general, Lloyd Austin, to be his Secretary of Defense. At any rate, the US president is the top national security manager, so to speak. He's in charge of national security policy, and he's in charge of the US military as the Commander-in-Chief. Also at the top of the US national security management hierarchy is the National Security Council, which is a part of the White House and reports directly to the president. It is led, as in India, by a national security advisor, and today, of course, that is Jake Sullivan, who I believe is one of the youngest U.S. national security advisors ever. The NSC has senior staff, known as senior directors and directors, who are in charge of national security policy in their areas of expertise. So in recent years, to throw out a few names that many of you will have heard of, security policy on India at the NSC has been managed by Lisa Curtis, who was the senior director for South Asia in the Trump administration. And now in the Biden administration, it is someone named Simona Guha. Now, one of the key functions of the NSC is not only to manage security policy, national security policy, but also to draft a national security strategy. Now, I would argue that the National Security Council tends to reflect how the US president likes to frame and conceptualize the idea of national security and how it is managed. So in that regard, it's notable that Biden's National Security Council has two notable new positions that did not exist before he took office as president. One is called Director for Indo-Pacific Affairs, which is a post held by Kurt Campbell. The other, which is really, I would argue, quite revolutionary in many ways, is U.S. Presidential Special Envoy for Climate. And John Kerry, a very distinguished statesman and former member of Congress, he holds that role now. Now, one might have expected this position, this latter position, to be housed in the State Department or somewhere else, but it is indeed housed at the NSC. And I think that what these two new positions show is that President Biden has two major priorities when it comes to foreign policy. One is China and US-China competition, because we all know that Indo-Pacific is, from a US perspective, all about the idea of countering China. And the other key priority in the national security context for President Biden is climate change. These are obviously not the only national security priorities, but they're two very preeminent ones. And the fact that he has created two new posts housed at the NSC focused on these issues, I think is very significant and is very telling. And I think is, quite frankly, a good idea, because those are issues that deserve particular prominence and from a bureaucratic standpoint should be at the top of the hierarchy. Now, there are many, many other U.S. government agencies and departments within the executive branch that focus on national security management. I certainly won't name them all. The main one, of course, is the Defense Department, or the Pentagon, as we call it here in DC, because of how the building is shaped. It is the main agency that coordinates the different components of the U.S. government dealing with national security policy. So it is the highest ranking institutional manager of U.S. national security, so to speak. And of course, its top official is the Secretary of Defense. It oversees national security policy as well as the different branches of the U.S. military. Remember what I said before about civilian supremacy over the military in the U.S. Now, the Pentagon is advised by a prominent and distinguished group of individuals called the Defense Policy Board. So beyond the Pentagon, there are many other institutions involved in national security management. Another key group of them are the agencies that comprise the U.S. intelligence community. The Central Intelligence Agency, which focuses on intelligence abroad. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which focuses on domestic issues in the U.S. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which focuses on military intelligence, as well as the National Security Agency, the NSA, which provides signals intelligence. The State Department has its own intelligence bureau, where as was noted by Venkat, I briefly served there hundreds of years ago when I was a young man. Great experience. It's called the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, known as INR. It goes by its initials. Now, the latter two agencies may be two of the less well-known U.S. intelligence agencies, but they are actually regarded by many as two of the best in terms of being correct about intelligence. So INR, the State Department, was praised for being one of the relatively few U.S. intelligence agencies that got things right about the question of nuclear weapons in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. It had pushed back against the idea that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, which of course was a main motivation for the Bush administration's decision to intervene in Iraq. I should say also that many of these intelligence agencies, they have analysts and they have spies. Obviously, as you know, the CIA, it has operatives, so to speak, that function overseas, but it also has a huge number of people that are based at the headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and elsewhere, who focus on desk analysis and research and so on. Now, the U.S. intelligence agencies do theoretically report to the president because he manages national security policy on the whole, but in practical terms, they report to the Director of National Intelligence, who oversees and coordinates policy within all the different intelligence agencies and bureaus. Now, this is a relatively new position that was established in 2004. It was part of a broader effort to reform national security policy management after the 9/11 attacks in order to strengthen intelligence policy and national security policy on the whole. And among those reforms that came soon after the 9/11 attacks were the establishment of new national security agencies, including, most importantly, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which was established in 2002 with its focus on protecting the U.S. homeland from threats. And it defines national security threats to the homeland very widely, as many U.S. government agencies do these days in this time of recognizing that non-traditional security threats are worth elevating in terms of importance. I think Venkat had made reference to this earlier. So the initial focus of the new Homeland Security Department when it was first established was terrorism, understandably, but it has since grown to include issues of cybersecurity, disaster prevention, and other non-traditional security threats. Its main function is to coordinate homeland security policy and to essentially develop strategies to keep the U.S. homeland safe. Now, experts have described the formation of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, as the most important U.S. government reorganization since the early days of the Cold War, when the National Security Act of 1947 put different military departments under the Secretary of Defense and also created key institutions like the NSC and the CIA. The formation of DHS, and pardon me for all the acronyms, I imagine you're following me, DHS, Department of Homeland Security. The formation of DHS also merged several dozen security agencies into it, including the Federal Emergency Management Association, or FEMA, which deals with natural disasters, hurricanes and the like. But the main agencies that I mentioned earlier, including the CIA and FBI, stayed separate and independent. Now, I also should note that many other U.S. government agencies that are not focused on, there are many other U.S. government agencies that are not focused on national security per se, but do nonetheless have some offices and bureaus that are dedicated to national security issues. So the State Department, of course, is the diplomatic arm of the U.S. government, the main diplomatic arm, but it has an intelligence bureau, as I noted. It also has a diplomatic security bureau. USAID, Agency for International Development, it focuses on development policy, but it also has an office, a rather opaque office, a very interesting office called the Office of Transitional Initiatives, or OTI, which focuses on bringing short-term development assistance, really a form of stabilization assistance, to countries that have recently exited from war, conflict, or authoritarianism. So it's really meant to serve U.S. security needs by bringing stabilization assistance to volatile areas. And it's quite frankly, not very transparent about what it does, unlike much of USAID. The U.S. Departments of Energy and also Health and Human Services have offices dealing with homeland security threats as well, which again are understood through a broad definition that includes human security as well as national security. Threats to public health, for example. All right, so everything that I've just discussed relates to the executive branch, where national security policies are made and coordinated. And remember, there are three branches of the U.S. government. Let's now turn to the legislative branch. And as you can imagine, this is Capitol Hill, Congress, comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And these are elected officials, of course. They're not elected staff that work for the members of Congress, but the members themselves are elected. There are three key national security management functions of the legislative branch. The first is the passing of budgets. This is a critical function, the passing of defense budgets. The executive branch can propose budgets, but the legislative branch makes the decisions on them. Now, the idea here is that members of Congress are elected officials. They represent the will of the people. They represent the people's mandate, and so they should be the ones making decisions about how U.S. taxpayer monies are used. This is democracy at its most basic and successful level, in my view. So one of the main key aspects of this defense budgeting process is the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, which is passed every year by the Congress and sets funding amounts for the U.S. Departments of Defense and State and some other agencies. Pardon me. And these appropriations are meant to last for the full fiscal year before a new act is passed for the next fiscal year. The second key national security function of the legislative branch is passing national security-focused laws, the passing of legislation. And this can range from decisions to announce security assistance for a particular country, or to impose sanctions on a particular country. And for legislation to become a law of the land, it must get a majority of votes in both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then approval, or essentially a signature from the U.S. president. So, Congress makes the laws, but the president has to sign off on them for them to become law. The third key national security function of the legislative branch is personnel related. So the U.S. Senate must confirm all senior cabinet level political appointees focused on national security and non-national security issues too. So there are Senate confirmation hearings for the individuals nominated by the U.S. President to be Secretary of Defense, Director of National Intelligence, Director of the CIA, and so on. Now, these confirmation hearings are sometimes contentious. They're not always rubber stamped. Sometimes you have someone nominated by the president who is not confirmed for whatever reasons, especially if they've had a political past and have said things that one of the senators presiding at the confirmation hearings may not like, especially if they're from the opposite political party. Now, interestingly, the National Security Advisor, which is essentially the top national security official in any U.S. government below the president, is not subject to Senate confirmation. They're just appointed by the president, and that's generally it. Except if they happen to be a 3 or 4-star general, in which case there's a bit of a different process. So let's move to the third branch of the U.S. government, that of the judiciary. Here, the role is, of course, legal. Legal processes involving national security play out in the judiciary. When there are, just to use a very basic, obvious example, when there are crimes related to national security, the judiciary investigates and prosecutes. The U.S. court system is involved in this process. And also when there are disputes about and concerns about national security related laws, the courts weigh in. And so 2 of the big hot button national security issues subjected to judicial review in the US in recent years relate to concerns about legal freedoms and privacy. So as many of you will know, the US, the Bush administration passed this series of laws after the 9/11 attacks meant to strengthen the capacity of the US government to go after terrorists and to tackle terrorism threats. The most well-known new law that came out is something called the Patriot Act. And it initially authorized officials to detain people without due process and to engage in heightened forms of surveillance. And these principles were contested by many in the US. So some of these provisions have subsequently been subjected to judicial scrutiny, and a few have been struck down. For example, one of the more controversial features of the original Patriot Act stated that immigrants can be detained even if they have not been formally charged with a crime. And the Supreme Court has since struck that principle down. Now, not to state the obvious, but when the Supreme Court issues a ruling on a national security related matter, then the executive branch and the legislative branches must abide by that decision. And this is one of the reasons why US democracy has remained so strong over the years. For the most part, these checks and balances and the power of the American state, which play out in a variety of contexts, including national security management, are present and are respected. So now that we've laid out some very basic content about the 3 branches of the US government and how they operate in US national security management, I'll just make some brief comments with more of an emphasis on management as opposed to the people and the institutions that do the managing. So first, let's talk a bit more about communication and national security management. Every day, usually in the mornings, first thing in the mornings, the US president receives a memo with a series of intelligence and other information about key US national security related matters. It also goes to some other senior officials and advisors, but it targets the president. That's the main audience. It is called the President's Daily Brief, or PDB. It's meant to focus the president's attention on the national security issues that her government deems to be the most pressing each day. And I should say that the intelligence community coordinates on putting this daily brief together. The PDB is, of course, classified, but interestingly, the CIA has declassified some of the PDBs prepared during the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford eras. And they're very interesting to read through, and they're posted on the CIA website if anyone is interested in reading these PDBs from previous decades. Another notable feature of the communication aspects of national security management is how big of a tent the president permits for deliberations over national security decisions. This is very dependent on the president and his personal preferences. So for example, to use very recent examples, there was a very strong contrast between President Obama and President Trump in terms of how they gathered inputs for national security management. President Obama was known for keeping a bigger tent, including more people in the national security management and decision-making process than was Trump, who stuck with a smaller group. And let me say here, I'm not trying to make a political statement or to say that one president's custom was better than the other. I'm just trying to draw a contrast. Anyhow, a very vivid and fascinating illustration of this contrast can be seen in the photos released by the respective White Houses after a major national security moment. So the Obama White House released a photo, which has become a very famous, classic, iconic one, of Obama and his top national security aides seated around the White House Situation Room table while watching the raid to apprehend Osama bin Laden play out back in May of 2011. It was a very large group. You had Obama, of course, sitting there, along with Joe Biden, his vice president at the time, his defense secretary, Robert Gates, his secretary of state, Hillary Clinton. He had his national security advisor there, along with his chief of staff. And there were also a number of deputies in the room. Further down the totem pole, Anthony Blinken at the time was the deputy national security advisor. And if you look closely at the photo, you can see there are also a number of fairly senior intelligence officials standing at the back of the room, craning their necks to look over everyone to see what was going on. So this was a lot of people in that situation room dealing with the process, the decision-making process, overseeing this incredibly important thing, this raid on bin Laden. I wish I could have shared the photo here so that you can see how it looked, but I'm sure many of you have seen this photo and know what I mean. Then, by contrast, you had a photo of Trump and his aides watching the raid that took down Baghdadi, another top terrorist, of course, the head of ISIS. Now, this photo is fascinating because it's so different from the Obama one, depicting the how his team was looking over the bin Laden raid. So there are only about 5 people in this picture: Donald Trump, his vice president Mike Pence, his national security advisor Robert O'Brien, his secretary of defense Mark Esper, and then 1 or 2 military aides, and that was it. So Trump was a national security manager who trusted the views and inputs of many fewer people than did Obama. And it showed in the photos of each of them taken during these 2 very seminal moments during each one's presidency. Trump wanted a very small number of people in the room, whereas Obama had a much larger group of folks in there that he wanted there to help provide him with inputs as he figured out how to proceed. So let me now come to the third and final part of this presentation by shifting gears and providing 3 different case studies of U.S. national security management during periods of crisis. And I think I always liked doing this when I was in graduate school. I have really much enjoyed reading up on historical crisis management in the U.S. It's always very interesting. But at times it would have been very scary for many of those living through the moments. But at any rate, basically this is just to give you a sense as to how the U.S. manages national security during crises and how it's done well and how it's done poorly and the lessons that can be drawn from it. So again, 3 examples. The first example is very well known and regarded as a major U.S. success story in crisis management. The second example is not very well known at all, but it is critically important in my view, given that it represents what I think is one of the major failures of U.S. crisis management in recent American history. And the third example is something very recent that everyone knows about, all of you sitting here in the room, and it represents another type of failure. But let's go in chronological order. So we'll start with 1960, October 1960. It's the height of the Cold War. I'm sure many of you know where I'm going with this. The John F. Kennedy administration has learned that the Soviet Union is installing nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in Cuba. The Kennedy administration knows that if they were to be launched, they could hit much of the U.S. East Coast in a mere few minutes. Cuba, of course, is a communist-governed island just off the coast of Florida. So Kennedy, back then, had a really difficult decision to make. Does he focus on confrontation? Does he focus on negotiation? So he and his advisors considered a wide array of options. A land invasion of Cuba, airstrikes, a blockade of the island, or diplomatic approaches. So they deliberated on these various alternatives for quite some time, even though there's a very tense situation developing. And I should say that the relationship between the Americans and the Soviets was particularly bad at this point, even before this crisis emerged. So in the end, the Kennedy administration decided on none of those options that I just mentioned. Instead, they opted for a naval blockade, a very narrowly focused blockade, a naval blockade of the island of Cuba to prevent new shipments of Russian missile material from arriving in Cuba. And so as a result, Soviet ships had to turn away as they sailed in with these missiles. And it became a game of chicken. Would the Soviets be tempted to launch a missile strike on the US in response to the blockade? Would the US keep up with this blockade? Well, in the end, the disaster was averted. And so the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, he backed down. He promised to take the missiles in Cuba back to the USSR. And in return, the US promised never to invade the island, even though, as some of you will know, the very next year there was a failed CIA operation to overthrow the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. At any rate, the US made that promise not to invade Cuba. And also, very notably, President Kennedy secretly agreed to something very important. He agreed to take down US nuclear-armed missiles that had been mounted in Turkey and which the Soviets regarded as a threat. So the crisis was averted. This is the closest that the world had come to nuclear war during the Cold War. And Kennedy was praised by many, including by his critics, for his handling of a very tense situation. This, of course, is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just a fascinating case study of crisis management. And I would certainly, for those of you that haven't read about it, I could recommend a few great books on it too. So let's now move to the second case study. And I said before that many of you likely will not have heard of this. Some of you will have heard of it. It's quite obscure. I happen to write my master's thesis on it, so I certainly have a lot of thoughts on it. And it really is a key lesson, in my view, for the failure of U.S. crisis management. It is called the Mayaguez Incident. So what is this? So it's May 1975. Now, this was a key moment, a critical moment in U.S. foreign policy. I imagine some of you may recall what had recently happened, right? The previous month, April 1975, was when the last U.S. soldiers left Vietnam, when you had the famous helicopter airlift picking up people off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and flying out as a humiliation for the U.S. That had happened a few weeks earlier. That's important context as we get into this story. So there was a U.S. container ship, a civilian cargo ship called the Mayaguez. It was seized by Khmer Rouge forces off the coast of Cambodia. Of course, the Khmer Rouge was this very repressive, brutal, genocidal government that was in control of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge forces claimed that this boat, this ship, the Mayaguez, was in Cambodian waters. The U.S. differed and said that it was international waters, but at any rate, the Khmer Rouge claimed it was Cambodian waters. So the Khmer Rouge forces sailed over to the ship, and they boarded it, and they hijacked it, and they took it to a small Cambodian island called Koh Tang. So President Gerald Ford, immediately once he found out what had happened, he convened his top national security aides. Some really interesting characters here that would become major names in U.S. Security policy history. Henry Kissinger was both his national security advisor and his Secretary of State. Arthur Schlesinger was his defense secretary. Donald Rumsfeld was a counselor to the president at the time. So they all got together to discuss what to do, and the big question was what to do. Should they try to make contact with the Khmer Rouge? It was, of course, a hostile government. So there was a lot of anger and a lot of emotion in the air. It was only a few weeks after the U.S. left Vietnam, and so influential players in the administration, especially Kissinger, wanted to send a very tough message to the Khmer Rouge. So the administration, without all that much deliberation, resolved to launch a military operation to recover the kidnapped Mayaguez crew, and it did so very soon after the ship was hijacked. So a large contingent of U.S. military personnel based in Southeast Asia were deployed to Koh Tang. The problem is that when the military operation was executed and when U.S. forces arrived on this island, they discovered that the Mayaguez was abandoned. The crew was gone. So the US forces arrived on the island to find an empty ship, and yet they immediately faced heavy fire from Khmer Rouge forces. So a few hours after they arrived, they got a big surprise when a small fishing vessel with a white flag appeared off the coast of Koh Tang. This was the Mayaguez Crew. The US forces later discovered that the Mayaguez Crew had been taken from Koh Tang to another island, and then after being questioned by Khmer Rouge operatives, they were set free. And so the crew came back to Koh Tang Island, where US forces were thinking that they were going to find the Mayaguez Crew there. So US forces knew that the Mayaguez Crew was freed and safe, but now they were taking heavy fire from the Khmer Rouge on the island of Koh Tang. So they focused on extraction, on getting their forces out of harm's way and out of the island. But it was a disaster. Several US helicopters crashed, and at the end of the whole incident, 41 Americans died in this incident. The last 41 names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC are the 41 men that died in Koh Tang in this Mayaguez incident. It later became known that several additional US troops were left behind by their compatriots, and they were later presumed dead. Their bodies were never found, but they were presumed dead too. So even though it's relatively unknown, the Mayaguez incident has become known as one of the biggest cases of crisis management failure in recent US history. So again, the US lost at least 41 soldiers in an operation meant to rescue civilian seamen who ended up not needing to be saved at all. Of course, the US didn't know that. The third case study that I'll highlight is very recent, from just last year. I don't need to go over that much because you all are aware of it. So August 15th, 2021, we all know what happened on that day. The Taliban took over in Afghanistan. It prompted scenes of chaos and panic as people poured to the airport to try to get out of the country. Over the next 2 weeks, the US struggled to manage the huge crowds at the airport in Kabul. People were, you all know the images. Afghans were hanging off US planes taking off. Terrorists took advantage of the chaos and staged one of the deadliest attacks in Afghanistan's history outside the Kabul airport. The incident brought comparisons to the Saigon airlift and the other chaotic exits from wars that signified US defeats. And the US got a lot of its friends and allies angry, especially within the NATO alliance. President Biden's domestic approval ratings fell significantly after this, with the Afghanistan crisis a major reason for it. So very briefly, what are the lessons from these three case studies? They're very simple, even obvious, but worth underscoring nonetheless. Good planning, the consideration of many policy alternatives, and calm, methodical, unemotional thinking are the hallmarks of sound national security management. When you don't plan ahead, when you get caught up in emotional considerations, that's when you run into problems. So Kennedy was praised for staying level-headed, even in a moment when tensions with the Soviets were sky high, and he was staring into the face of possible nuclear annihilation. His administration carefully considered a range of alternatives, and then he made a decision, and he stuck with it. Now, during the Mayaguez crisis, the administration let the Vietnam defeat get to it too much. So Kissinger, the national security advisor, actually said to President Ford, and I quote, "We need to give the Khmer Rouge a bloody nose." The administration was fixated on the need to restore U.S. credibility and to show toughness following its humiliating exit from Vietnam a few weeks earlier. And this is what they discussed during their deliberations, not possible alternatives, not whether it was better to wait until they had more information about what would happen with the Mayaguez Crew. And so as a result, the administration acted, I would argue, impulsively, recklessly, and with deadly consequences in terms of American lives. As for the Afghanistan crisis, there were many factors that led to the Taliban taking power before the U.S. withdrawal, to the surprise of U.S. officials, none of whom expected the Taliban to do that. But that very U.S. surprise is an indication, I think, of a national security management failure. The U.S. failed to account for the possibility that the Taliban would take over so quickly. So the Biden administration, when it was laying out scenarios for what could happen after President Biden announced his decision to withdraw back in April, fail to account for what should have been seen as the least likely but most dangerous outcome. The fact that it didn't account for the scenario, the Taliban takeover before the withdrawal was complete, led to the very panicked and chaotic policy response that played out, one where there was no plan to prevent panicked Afghans from rushing to the airport, no plan to deal with the huge crowds at the airport, and I would also argue a need to scramble to deal with the consequent crises that emerged from the Taliban takeover, one being the humanitarian crisis that was set in motion, of course. Now, in the administration's defense, the Trump administration, according to Biden officials, did not do a good job of sharing intelligence and other information about Afghanistan before it stepped down. This is the view of the Biden administration. So one could perhaps argue that perhaps the very rocky and volatile transfer of power from the Trump to the Biden administration had implications for Afghanistan policy, meaning the administration was missing some key information that could have better clued it into the fact that the Taliban was a threat to take over much earlier than expected. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. We began with a survey of some of the key U.S. national security management institutions and individuals as they play out within the three branches of U.S. government. I then offered a few brief words about how the coordination and the communication of national security management is done. And then I wrapped up with three what I hope are illustrative case studies to show how U.S. national security policy is managed, and particularly during crises. And I think you get the best sense of how an administration handles national security management when you have a major crisis at play. So with that, there's of course a lot that I didn't get to, and I'm happy to answer questions that are comments or rebuttals that any of you have following the talk. But with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you, Michael. I think that was obviously a very difficult job for you to try and put together everything in such a short time. But you've done a remarkable job. And as I was listening to you, I think, and this is a point that Professor Patel mentioned about the importance of actually countries like India and the United States learning of each other. And especially in the complicated security environment that we face today, India is closely watching in terms of how the United States is managing its national security challenges and how are they responding to some of these challenges. So I think by giving overview of some of the key institutions, the positions within the national security architecture, and also speaking about the three branches of government which all of us are aware of in India, a very similar structure. And more importantly, touching upon, I think, three case studies. Of course, you mentioned about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Graham T. Allison's seminal work on the Cuban Missile Crisis is something that I think you would recommend to all students to read on one of these. And there are multiple other, I think, instances of where one could always look at whether the United States did succeed. Of course, the most famous of them is what happened in September 11, 2001, which, of course, you haven't touched upon. But broadly, I think you've done a remarkable job. Your observation about the civilian-military dynamics, I think, is extremely pertinent from Indian point of view. Your mention about some of the declassified documents, the briefings, I think this is another very important issue that's been deliberated in national security circles, because how do you declassify? When do you do it? How do you give access to the larger strategic community? I think these are key questions that are currently being debated upon. And also you mentioned about a national security strategy, which is also something that the larger strategic community in India has been deliberating upon. And of course, in recent times, Pakistan has come out with such a document. So I would stop here, and I'm fairly certain that this vast audience would would want to make some comments, observations. I request every one of you to please just kindly be brief so that we can take as many of your questions. I know Jaideep is raring to go from the Northeast. Jaideep, before I come to you, of course, Professor Patel wants to respond, and then I'll come to Jaideep, and then I'll come to Professor Gaur. Patel, sir, please.
Thank you for giving me this privilege to ask the questions first. Michael, I have two questions. You are well aware of the National Security Advisory Board, of which I'm a member too. My question is, how does the National Security highest office, that is the President's office, gets the independent input? Because in our case, we are National Security Advisory Board members. We are independent experts, do not belong to any offices or any party. Depending upon our expertise, we give input, to the policymaking apparatus. Does United States have, at the highest level, such kind of a feeder mechanism where the public views or what is happening in the world in very objective, neutral manner can be fed into the system? That is my question number one. Second question is, we do not have the national security strategy, right? We do not have, we do have, but it is unwritten. Whereas for every single thing, US comes out with a strategy. In your view, does it make a sense, and to what effect, to have a written national security strategy? As Venkat just mentioned, recently Pakistan came out with its own, and there was all kind of reactions from across the globe, particularly from its neighbor in India. So do you believe in importance of having a well laid out, well documented national security strategy? These are my two questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dr. Patel. Those are two great questions. So the second question I could answer first. Yes, I do think that it makes good sense to have a published, written national security strategy. I think for the purposes of transparency and democracy, it's a good thing. I mean, the U.S. national security strategy, I'm sure there are parts of it that are not made public, but there is a public version that's put out there. And I think it's important for the American people to have a sense of the formal policy that their government is laying out and is pursuing. And I think it sort of says something about accountability too, right? If the American people know that there's a formal policy that's on the books and that there's an expectation that it be pursued, I think that's certainly a good thing. And obviously, if it's not published, if it's not as readily available, it's more difficult for the populace to track that, so to speak. The fact that the U.S. comes out with it, frequently updates its national security strategy, I think that's an important thing too. So yeah, I think that, I know it's a very sensitive issue for sure, and it depends on the context. But I think that to me, there's no compelling reason or no compelling factor that would override the significant advantages of having a written, published NSS, National Security Strategy. Now, in terms of your first question, it's interesting you ask it. I was actually trying to think this through. I was trying to understand if there's some type of equivalent in the U.S. to your NSAB. I don't think there is, at least not one aligned in the way that that yours is, with former senior officials directly advising the key principles. As I said before, there is somewhat of an analog in the Defense Department, where you have a National Defense Advisory Board. That's comprised of former senior officials who are appointed periodically. But in terms of the NSC, naturally, I've never worked at the NSC, and when you talk to people that staff the NSC, they're not going to talk about where they get their information from. But I think that they really depend on in-house inputs. They certainly depend on the classified inputs that come in from the PDBs that I mentioned earlier, and other inputs coming from the intelligence community, overseen by the Director of National Intelligence. And certainly they do engage. I will say that can say just among us that the National Security Council staff, including the director level staff responsible for different regions or countries, they do engage with outside experts, including myself and others like me. So they sometimes seek us out to get a sense as to what we think about how things are playing out, and we enjoy sort of providing that advice and hearing what their take is as well, to the extent that they're able to speak about these things, which frequently they're not. So I think it would be great if there were an NSAB in the U.S. But so far as I know, there isn't one, at least not one configured in the way that the one in India is.
Just to add on this question, is there is there thought process to have such one in United States?
I'm sorry, is there a thought process for what?
To have such a NSAB kind of structure in the US?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I really don't know. I should try to get a sense, but I know that that the NSC is aware, or some on the NSC are aware of your NSAB. I'm sure there have been interactions over the years, so there's awareness that it exists. But I'm not sure if there's actually been a formal deliberation to form it. But I think it makes good sense. It certainly would be something worth looking into, or worth pursuing. I imagine that on informal levels, you have former distinguished people interacting with members of the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. So I think that you may have this informal dynamic of an NSAB. You just don't have it formalized as it is in India. So one would think that it should be relatively easy to formalize something that's already playing out informally and has been for quite some time.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you,
Michael. Thank you, sir. Jaideep, would you like to go ahead and briefly introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Michael, I really thank you for this fascinating presentation, or rather a tutorial that you sort of just gave us. I have a sort of unusual question, since you gave these 3 case studies about both success and failure of US strategy in different theaters of the world. Operation Inherent Resolve, would you characterize that as a success? Because I've been doing some research in recent months, and forgive me if my question or comment is a little longish, but you were trying to in Islamic State, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, were they had a well-defined territorial limit, Iraq and Syria, and Operation Inherent Resolve totally ousted them. So after the territorial ouster, Baghdadi's successor, Qureshi, and his band left, spirited away, really, and they could be anywhere in the world now. So earlier, when you had a situation where you knew exactly, and there were could be proper surveillance and observed. As a matter of fact, the second phase of radicalization, which I term it as that, which called the faithful, or the radicals from all over the world to take the bay'ah, or the oath of allegiance. They took the hijrah to Iraq and Syria, even from India. So we had the radicals all impounded in a literal sense in one territorial limited area. Now, Operation Inherent Resolve sort of ousted them, and they could be now anywhere. As a matter of fact, they have different avatars now. For instance, they have sort of metamorphosed into Islamic State of the Khorasan province in Afghanistan. They've entered India by name of the Wali-e-Hind, or the Guardians of Hindustan. So do you think, in the matrix of what you were talking about, I was quite curious because you gave those case studies, 3 interesting case studies. Do you think, looking back, do you think, retrospectively, do you think Operation Inherent Resolve should have been a little more calibrated an operation? And well, as you said, Baghdadi was targeted, etc. But the fact of the matter is the total territorial ouster of the Islamic State have sent them all over the world today. And we don't really know where Qureshi is, for instance. And they have got Islamic State of provinces all over the world. And that seems to me a very, very dangerous situation in the future. Irregular warfare situation is sort of, emerging for the United States, for the far enemy, as they call it, and certainly for India and Assam. I reside and work in the bordering state of Assam in the northeastern part of India, which strategically borders Myanmar and China. So your comments and your, if you could sort of throw some light on this aspect.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that great question and comment. I think one of the big mistakes of U.S. national security policy in the 21st century has been prematurely declaring victory over major terrorist organizations. You had President Obama, President Bush. Well, yeah, you could look at President Bush, you could look at President Obama, you could look at President Trump, all at one point or the other declaring major victories over terrorist organizations and terrorists. I think there's a tendency to think that when Bin Laden was apprehended and executed, that Al Qaeda was done with, and there was no more need to worry about it. And then we oftentimes would hear President Trump stating that ISIS had been dismantled. And once Baghdadi was gone, it was celebrated. But yeah, I mean, we've seen that these terror groups are so much more than their leaders. They're so much more than their parent organizations. I think that one of the big stories in the issue of international terrorism has been the ability of these groups to proliferate into very powerful affiliates that become very strong. And you yourself very rightly mentioned that ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, has become a pretty formidable group. It's probably the most powerful affiliate of Islamic State right now, and it could get even stronger given what's happening in Afghanistan. So yeah, I would not say that. And I should say that I'm not an expert on terrorism in the Middle East. I focus more on South Asia. But I think that it would be premature just because ISIL, whatever you want to call it, lost its caliphate, so to speak, its so-called caliphate. It lost its territory. That should not suggest that Operation Resolve was a success, right? Just because we know that the group continues to pose a threat, not in terms of taking over territory and holding it, but more so in just doing terrible things and blowing people up, that type of thing. So I think that there's a need to be humble when it comes to assessing the degree of success that the U.S. has had in these counterterrorism operations. I mean, certainly the incidents of terrorist violence have receded in terms of what's perpetrated by those groups and their affiliates, but still, they clearly are very dangerous. And as someone that keeps a close eye on Afghanistan, I certainly worry about ISK. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jaideep. Thanks, Michael. I'll go to Professor Gore now, and I know there's a couple of questions on the chat box, but I'll go to Professor Gore and then take those questions and then come to Suraj. Professor Gore?
Yes, sir. Good evening, Michael ji. From my side, thank you very much for giving an illuminating talk this evening to all of us. And my question to you is, that is, there may be a lot of scientific advisory groups or committees in US also as far as national security is concerned. How much importance is given by the US administration to their views in, you can say, assessing internal security or external security, or political wills prevail?
Well, thank you, Dr. Gar. That's a great question, and I think an important question to ask. And I think that unfortunately, the answer to your question is both. And it depends on the administration. It depends on the proclivities of the president of the moment. To be quite frank, some administrations are more transparent and more receptive to the inputs from outside advisors than others are. I mean, this is just the way it is. And I think that we look at the Trump administration, which was very different on so many levels from previous administrations in terms of how they viewed the issue of, national security. President Trump, he trusted a relatively small number of individuals when it came to inputs on pretty much anything, not just national security, but certainly on national security as well. So he was, quite frankly, he was particularly receptive to what his family would tell him, more so than, what he may hear from a distinguished, very prominent former national security practitioner. He had a very small group of advisors that he trusted. There was a lot of turnover. He removed many of them, including, he had several national security advisors, as you know. But I think with other administrations, there has been this discussion about how important the issue of expertise is for administrations. And I remember when I was in graduate school, I don't want to date myself, but when I was in graduate school during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, it's a very interesting debate in academic circles about, how important was it at such a critical moment for U.S. foreign policy and national security policy with 9/11, the war in Iraq, so on and so forth. How important was it at the end of the day for academic experts, those that maybe had served in the national security bureaucracy or policy at one point? How important was it for them to be in a position to provide inputs to an administration that was really struggling with so many challenges? And there was a split. Some thought that it wasn't, that if you're an academic, you may not have a good sense of the context about how policymaking works. And even to those that had previously served as policymakers who had been far removed from the process for such a long time, and they couldn't be relevant. But I would just say, to answer your question, for risk of overgeneralizing, I do think that generally speaking, presidential administrations, White Houses, and the national security councils, they are interested in engaging with people on the outside, especially those based in Washington at think tanks, those that would be perceived to have an understanding not only of the issues, but also of how the policymaking process works. So even if they hadn't served in the government, that being in Washington, they would just know how things work. So yeah, I think going back to what I said before, there's always been interest in, and there is now, informal processes where former officials are advising folks of the NSC. But in terms of formal advisory boards, you don't have much of that, with DOD being one of the exceptions. But yeah, I think that, I know there was a question about this in the chat, which we can get into, but certainly domestic political factors are always going to play a role in policy and decisions about national security policy. That's just a given, and especially in a democracy, for sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gaur sir. A couple of questions on the chat box. One is from Mary Bimudu. So she says that, Michael, the rocky transfer of power from Trump to Biden led to the Afghan crisis and the uncertainty over the presidential elections in 2000. And then the transfer of power led to the September 11, 2001. So essentially, she's giving you two case studies, one in 2000 leading to the 9/11 and the other one in 2020 leading to the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan, to ask this question that does domestic politics now increasingly shape the national security management or narrative in the US?
Yeah, thanks to Mary for the great question. I mean, I'm not sure I would overstate the impact that rocky transitions have had on those seminal events, the 9/11 attacks, the Afghan crisis. I mean, I did myself mention the possibility that was the case with the Afghan crisis, but I wouldn't overstate that. Pardon me. And I'm not convinced that there's a compelling argument that the 9/11 attacks, that the U.S. failure to anticipate them and so on, that was tied to, the messy transition of power. I think in both cases, you have to look at more like issues of intelligence failures and other issues, more so than those issues of presidential volatile transfers of power. But that said, I do think in the Afghan crisis case that it is something to consider. The fact that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, was publicly, going on the record saying the Trump administration has not been forthcoming in sharing information and intelligence. That's made it difficult for us to carry out our own review about our policy in Afghanistan. That is problematic. Though then again, once the Biden administration took office and its people were confirmed, they were privy. They were able to get access to all the intelligence coming in from Afghanistan on what the Taliban was up to, and how badly the Afghan security forces were failing, and so forth. So I wouldn't overstate that transfer of power factor, but it certainly is something to consider, at least in the context of the Afghanistan crisis. But yeah, look, I mean, domestic issues will always be a major influence on national security management, and I think, and policy more broadly. And I go back to one of the examples I gave about the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, was a major law that came out right after the 9/11 attacks, and the goal was very security focused. It was to better protect America and to allow the government to have more power to do what it felt it had to do to protect the security of Americans. But it was very controversial. It was very polarizing. It became very politicized. And so, many aspects of that law ended up being peeled back. I mentioned before that many principles, many provisions of it were contested in the law, went all the way to the Supreme Court. Many thought that it was a threat to U.S. democracy. It was a major issue for many years. And so I think here is a case where, domestic factors, e.g., domestic political opposition to the Patriot Act, especially from the opposing party, compelled the government, because of the decisions of the Judiciary, the executive had to pare back on the Patriot Act. And many supporters of the Patriot Act thought that this was actually something that undermined U.S. security. The fact that you had to take steps back from this really important national security law because some people thought that it was going to be an impingement on their privacy and their freedom, which supporters of the law thought that was an inconvenience that you could certainly accept in order to ensure that you're not going to suffer another 9/11 like attack in the U.S. So that's an example right there. But I would argue that there's sort of like the flip side of this, right? With so many case studies we could have talked about. The Iraq War, 2003. Once it became clear that the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq, very controversial. You had major opposition from the opposition party. You had protests, demonstrations around the U.S., especially in Washington, against the idea of an invasion. But that didn't stop the Bush administration. It felt that its national security objectives ensure that it had to go through with this war. It ended up launching the war on false premises, which is very unfortunate. But here is a case where the administration discounted local or sort of domestic political considerations and pushed through it anyway. And so, the key national security managers had many discussions about whether it was the right thing to do to invade, whether to wait. And, I don't think domestic political considerations weighed in on their decisions about whether to do that or not. There are many other examples that one could give one way or the other, but yeah, I think that it's a known truth that domestic politics not only plays a key role in U.S. national security management, but also U.S. foreign policy as well. There have been so many great books written on the role that domestic politics play in U.S. foreign policy because of, the advocacy that you have on Capitol Hill from interest groups and trying to impact U.S. thinking about what it does with foreign policy. There's a lot of that. So there definitely are big links here.
Thank you, Mary. Himatri Das, one of our students, I think, is probably talking about turf wars, Michael. And she's talking about how is the dynamics between the new Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense in terms of handling cases related to national security. Are there frictions there? Do they work closely? Because, I think she's, there have been cases even in India, for example, where we've had turf wars and not, sort of not taking up responsibilities and attributing failures to one another. So I think she's just attributing to that.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I appreciate it. It's hard for me to answer specifically just because I'm not privy to the internal politics of the two agencies in terms of how that plays out. But indeed, there's always turf wars. And the Homeland Security Department is a bit controversial because it's relatively new. As I said, it was one of the products of these post 9/11 national security reforms here, and it subsumed many other big agencies in there. So it's a huge bureaucracy. I think it's the second or third largest government agency at this point. The Pentagon is the biggest, incidentally. Veterans Affairs is number two. But yes, I can't point to any specific cases, but I'm sure that there have been turf wars, and again, a lot of it depends on who's running the show. And I know that when the Homeland Security Department was first established, the first director was a guy named Tom Ridge, who was he had no experience in national security policy. He'd been the governor of Pennsylvania, a political ally of President George W. Bush's. And so there was some pushback. I think people tried to take advantage of his lack of experience. Some didn't like the way he carried out the agency's functions and so on. But in terms of very recent turf wars or conflicts, that I don't know. I think it's more common to see disagreements between the State Department and the Pentagon than it is with DHS. DHS has such a broad mandate these days that I think it has so many portfolios that it takes care of by itself, where it's not necessarily going to be sparring with DoD. And I would argue that when it comes to pure national security management, thinking of this from a traditional national security lens, so much more of that, the power for that lies with DoD. But I think Dr. Patel had asked earlier how you sort of distinguish between external national security policy management and internally focused. DHS is the main agency focused on internal security for sure, but the FBI does that too. And so I think that it may be more accurate to look at those two agencies as places where you have to worry about turf wars, places where there is a clear overlap in cases in terms of what both are meant to do. Both agencies focus on internal security. But again, I don't have any specific examples that I could point to, unfortunately.
Michael, I think it's kind of fascinating because, if you look at the Indo-US relationship and the trajectory that's taken off in the last few years, we've had these foundational agreements that we've signed, and there seems to be a clear sort of convergence of interest when it comes to the defense domain, possibly because of our understanding of the threat from a rising China. Fascinatingly, there was a Homeland Security dialogue that was established in 2011 that kind of seems to have tapered off. And it's only in the recent past, in 2020, that there's been attempts made. I think it is March 2021 when there's been this attempt to restart the Homeland Security dialogue. So I think that's also possibly one of the points to consider in terms of where the priority seems to have been more focused on defense issues and maybe lesser on homeland. But moving forward, maybe we will start focusing more on some of the internal domestic challenges that both the United States and India faces. So I think that's going to be fascinating. I had a question to ask you, but I'll come to that later. I'll ask Suraj now. I know he's been waiting patiently to ask a question, and then Kamal. Suraj, if you're around, if you could quickly ask your question, please. Suraj, are you around? Okay, we'll come back to you. Kamal?
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning to you, sir, and good evening to all on the screen. And myself, Kamaluddin Saeem from Afghanistan, and recently a student of international relations in RRU. Sir, as you truly pointed that this Afghanistan crisis was a big mistake of US, and everyone is, criticizing US because of this. So I just want to know that how US will deal with the Taliban now, as the Taliban took over of Afghanistan, and many people are suffering there. So how US will deal with these people in the future?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's wonderful that you, a young man from Afghanistan, can take advantage of this this course. I think it's terrific, and I'm very sorry for what is happening in Afghanistan now. I know it must be so difficult for you being from there. I think that looking at your question from a national security management lens, I think that the Biden administration now looks at Afghanistan through a much more narrowly focused lens than when it had troops there. I think that the focus is, quite frankly, less on the Taliban and more so on the humanitarian crisis, and trying to come up with a coherent plan for how to do more to help ease that humanitarian crisis in ways that don't involve dealing directly with the Taliban, because the administration will not recognize the Taliban government anytime soon, if at all. And so, I think it becomes this big conundrum that everyone is talking about, that we know that simply sending some humanitarian aid to Afghanistan will not end the humanitarian crisis, because the scale of the crisis is so much broader than that. You have a broader economic crisis and a banking sector that's near collapse and an economy that's near collapse. But I'll be very candid that I think that the president was very blunt when he said that we have bigger priorities elsewhere. He said this very explicitly when he announced his decision to withdraw. So, all national security managers, they always have a lot on their plates, right? I mean, the top people are always juggling all kinds of national security challenges. And I think that, Afghanistan is above all also a humanitarian crisis. It's not a security crisis at this point. So I think that, seen from this lens, as significant as things are there in Afghanistan, I think that we can't really expect the administration to do much beyond doing what it can to coordinate with the UN and with NATO partners and others to figure out some way to scale up its assistance to the country in ways that can go beyond short-term, band-aids, so to speak, to fend off starvation for another few months. But I know the administration is quite frankly, they don't have a plan. They're still trying to figure out what to do. But beyond that, if you look at there's so many hotspots right now, and it looks like that there's a good chance Russia could invade Ukraine. There's brewing problems in the Balkans now and Bosnia, and of course there's so much going on in the Middle East. You had this upsurge in Houthi violence. So. And then North Korea is always concerning to the U.S. So it's just a lot to deal with. And I think that with U.S. troops having pulled out of Afghanistan, that will inherently limit the focus that the administration will place on this issue. And I do feel bad telling you this, but I just wanted to be candid, sharing with you what I've observed from recent observations and engagements with U.S. officials. They want to help with the humanitarian crisis, but there's not much more beyond that they're thinking about. And for all this talk of creating this over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan, there hasn't been much movement on that, and I don't think that's a priority right now. I'm not sure if it will be, but the focus now is on the humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Michael. I don't know whether Suraj is still around, but if he is, he can. Otherwise, is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Yes, Kritika.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning, sir. So, my first question is: isn't this kind of protectionist behavior in national security that America showed in Afghanistan? Wasn't this completely against of his hegemonic attitude? One, and the second is how America's national security changes and evolves according to this new technologies, these new technologies like quantum technology, this laser communication and artificial intelligence that affects the national security, and how the national security of America changes and responds to this cyber threats from China and North Korea. Since now the report has came up that North Korea has around stolen around $400 million dollar of cryptocurrency now. So how America responds to such threats, new technologies, and this protectionist behavior?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was just, again, pardon me, several wonderful questions. Thanks for posing them. So in terms of the first one, I would argue, I assume you're referring to the Biden administration. President Biden has never been comfortable about long-term military commitments. So he had never wanted to stay in Afghanistan very long. He was, when he was vice president in the Obama administration, he was one of the only key members of the administration that was opposed to the troop surge that Obama ended up announcing in 2009. So it's not actually that surprising that he decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. And I guess you could call it protectionist. I guess I would call it more, an issue of one of restraint, that Biden thinks that U.S. power should be certainly exerted, but not through long-term military commitments. And he would push back against the views of opponents of withdrawal that say that you could keep a small contingent of troops in Afghanistan for an indefinite period of time at a relatively low cost. He would push back against that and say, well, no, we've already spent all of this money over the years there. Had troops stayed in Afghanistan, the Taliban likely would have started attacking them again because it would have violated this agreement that was signed by the Trump administration in Doha back in 2020. So yeah, I think that the decision to withdraw was not that surprising. It was actually quite predictable. And I think it was a function of Biden's view of national security and foreign policy, that it should be carried out in a way that the U.S. does not need to maintain open-ended long-term military commitments. Now, your other questions were excellent, and I think that they're combined, and I think they sort of answer themselves. Absolutely, I would argue that cybersecurity has become probably the big new sort of non-traditional security threat that's on the minds of the NSC, on the minds of the president. Clearly, America's top rivals are all, unfortunately, well-known proliferators of cyber attacks, hacking. You look at North Korea, you look at China, you look at Iran, you look at Russia. They're all there. They're all doing these things that are very concerning for the U.S. And I think that, not to get too much in the weeds, but I think for domestic political reasons, the Biden administration is particularly concerned about these threats, just because it believes that Hillary Clinton was denied the presidency because of Russian hacking, so to speak, and Russian, cyber attacks and things that they did to undermine the Democratic Party. Obviously, this is a very political, controversial contention. I'm just articulating the way the Democratic Party feels about this. So they would have a particularly strong interest in increasing capacity to deal with these cyber threats. I can't point to specific initiatives because, I think that all I can say at this point is that it is a priority, a big priority for the Biden administration. And I should say that I think Venkat and many others will agree that there's a lot of, I think, scope for cooperation. Part of the U.S.-India relationship, that cyber can be a major component of sort of the next phase of security cooperation, because both of our countries and governments are very concerned about these things. India, of course, has been very vulnerable to Chinese cyber threats as well. So I think this should be something that really animates the next phase of security cooperation between our two countries.
Yeah, Michael, can't agree more with you. The fact that we've started this cybersecurity dialogue now, sometime in 2017, and this is handled at the level of the Deputy National Security Advisor from the Indian side. So I'm aware of that. So I can't agree more with you. I think we'll have to come to the end of this session because we've had about a couple of hours of really fascinating discussion. Michael, I'm going to very quickly, request you to answer a couple of queries, and this is more for the benefit of our students here. One is from an American perspective, sitting in Washington, what would you classify as the top 3 or top 5 national security priorities or threats today? That's question number 1. The second is, I think, taking off from what Jaideep had initially asked you about the moving theater of threat posed by the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda. I'm sure you are aware of the State Department Bureau of Counterterrorism's report that came out in 2020, which alluded to this very fact that ISIS and the Al Qaeda was moving its theater slowly to the subcontinent. Now, this is quite fascinating because after the nuclear deal and then the defense cooperation characterized by the foundational agreement between India and the US, I think we've been searching for the next big idea. Now, counterterrorism has been on the shelf for a long time. We've been having this joint working group meeting, the designations group meeting for a very long time. And there's been a lot of talk. But I think a lot of it has also, the cooperation is stalled because of the United States looking at the issue more at a global scale, while India was looking at it more specifically from a regional perspective. Now, with the global threat actually emerging in the region, there could actually be a convergence of interests between India and US on counterterrorism, and I'm expecting that to be the next big, arena where we will see a lot of active cooperation. And even the beginning of this dialogue between the Homeland Security, the Homeland Security dialogue with its counterpart in the US kind of tends to indicate that cyber asymmetric warfare, threats to the democratic political process, these are all emerging as key concerns in both countries and possibly could lead to future areas of cooperation. Your response, please.
Yeah, so great question. So the first one about the 5 top national security challenges that I see it from the U.S. Yeah, great question. I guess I could throw out the first 5 that come to mind in terms of seriousness, not necessarily in order of importance, but 5 key ones. I think that cyber has to be up there, just because in terms of how it has ascended so quickly to the top of national security policymakers' concerns, so to speak, and thinking not just about the fact that these cyber attacks are happening more frequently, but how catastrophic it could be, right? I mean, if you have someone that's able to hack into air traffic controllers' communication, you could cause airplanes to crash. You could have huge loss of life. Obviously, there's so many other examples. So I'd put that at the top of the list. Yeah, terrorism is still top 5, absolutely, for sure. For the reasons that you mentioned, that we're seeing it evolve, and I think that evolve in ways that.
Michael, a quick intervention. When you say cyber, is the threat more from China and Russia? Would you characterize that?
I think so, yeah. I think so, especially China. But yeah, China and Russia for sure. Then Iran. My sense is that Iran doesn't have the capacity that China and Russia do, but I would definitely include Iran in there. North Korea, maybe not as much, but yeah, China and Russia for sure. And I think that particularly given the trajectory of bilateral relations, and I think the U.S. and Russia are in a confrontational relationship, as the U.S. and China are. U.S. and Iran, it's a volatile relationship, but it's not quite as bad as the U.S. relations with those other two. So terrorism, absolutely top 5, because as I said, the threat is evolving in ways that policymakers are still trying to catch up with and understand. And I think on that front, the issue of homegrown terrorism, we didn't really get into this. I think that U.S. policymakers recognize that homegrown terrorism is arguably a bigger threat than terrorism from abroad. So, given what happened on January 6th of last year, the Biden administration regards those people that stormed the Capitol as terrorists. It sees them as domestic terrorists, and I do too. Those incidents are more, you have more cases, more known cases of these far-right violent groups wanting to commit attacks. You have more of that than known cases of sleeper cells of Al Qaeda or ISIS in the U.S. You don't have that. There's very little of that. So I think that it's as the U.S. security policy officials see this, they look at terrorism from a very broad lens, not just as a threat posed by Al Qaeda or ISIS, but threat posed by those groups and especially their affiliates, and especially in terms of people that are inspired by those groups and carry out lone wolf attacks, right? So that's definitely a key challenge. I would argue as well that climate change is quickly emerging as a key security threat, not in the immediate way that those other two are, but it's getting more so. I mean, I mentioned before that Biden created a new climate change position, right, in the Security Council. And, you know, we all know the threat posed by climate change and how destructive it can be, how deadly it can be, the impacts that it has on things like water, like resource issues, and how the water shortages and scarcity could become triggers for conflict. So I think that, you know, this is something that the administration and previous administrations as well have highlighted in national security strategies, in national intelligence estimates. That's a big one, for sure, right there. I mean, there's no getting around with that. Beyond that, I think you have to look at countries. China is considered a security threat, not in terms of the direct security threat, in terms of a threat to the U.S. homeland, but the perception of China being an increasingly aggressive competitor, especially through its provocations in the South China Sea that threatened key U.S. allies and treaty partners. You know, what it did in Ladakh, which of course is a crisis that still hasn't been addressed. So I think that the U.S. sees China as a security threat in that regard. And it views Russia as a security threat as well through its own provocations and threats, and especially if you have a conflict with the Ukraine and NATO states. I think that sort of constitutes a security threat in of itself. Now, to your other question about you know, how this issue of counterterrorism cooperation plays out, yeah, it should be very interesting to see how it evolves. I think that the Afghanistan withdrawal sort of complicates the issue of U.S.-India counterterrorism cooperation, just because, you know, we're not there anymore. It's very difficult for us for the U.S. to target terrorist organizations present in Afghanistan. So I think that the attention will turn to, you know, the groups that have always been a concern of both countries, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, which both have a presence in Afghanistan. But the U.S. capacity to monitor those threats has been weakened because it no longer has assets on the ground there. So, which is, I think, a bit of a challenge for U.S.-India security relations. But I think, going back to something you may have mentioned earlier, Venkat, as the U.S. and India start to execute these foundational agreements that they've concluded in recent years, that I think will allow for more intelligence sharing between the two militaries. It will allow for more technology sharing. Hopefully that will help both countries, especially India, strengthen their capacity to monitor the movement and location of these groups, whether we're talking, certainly in terms of their movements and location in Pakistan. But I think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan does pose some notable challenges for counterterrorism cooperation. But, you know, it's a relationship where security cooperation has largely revolved around Indo-Pacific issues, countering China, that type of thing. So I think the issue of counterterrorism cooperation, which was very strong and emerged in a big way after the 9/11 attacks, I think there's a need to try to restore momentum to that and rethink how the counterterrorism cooperation factor can play into some of these new variables, especially the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Thank you, Michael. I know Suraj has just come back. So Suraj, I'm going to give you that one last chance. Please be brief with your question.
Thank you very much, sir. So just a question on the United States angle of diplomacy. How do you see diplomacy as a factor affecting national security? Because I think post the Afghanistan withdrawal, we have seen the United States face the heat in certain committees, to be really very honest, such as the International Law Commission itself, where the United States was not elected as a member there. And post that, I just wanted to know your views about how diplomacy is affecting the United States stand on national security, because as you mentioned, China as one of the potential contenders and also a security threat, it's doing exceedingly well when it comes to diplomacy, especially in the African region. So your thoughts on that, sir? That's all.
Yeah, thanks. A great question. Well, we all know what Clausewitz said, that war is diplomacy by other means, and I think you could argue that diplomacy is the best way to avoid war. And the U.S., this administration certainly sees it that way. It's been very notable that the administration has tried to reach out to its competitors and its rivals with diplomacy. There have been high-level engagements with China. Some of them haven't gone very well, including that meeting in Alaska where the two sides started yelling at each other. But clearly, the fact that President Biden has been willing to meet with Putin several times. He'd been criticized by many within his own party that it was too soon to be reaching out to the enemy, so to speak. But that's notable, and I think that indicates a desire to try to do what's possible to smooth some of these diplomatic tensions that could sort of spiral into security tensions. Now, I believe that Secretary of State Blinken is either on his way or already is in Kiev to go talk with leaders there. There have already been engagements with the Russian side. The U.S. is trying to do what it can to avert a war in Ukraine. I certainly hope it succeeds. But and then if you look at Iran, now the Biden administration had promised that it was going to get back into that nuclear deal with Iran. It hasn't succeeded. It's found out it's a lot easier said than done. But again, there have been some efforts and outreach, diplomatic outreach with Iran. That's more difficult than it is with Russia or China because you don't have a formal relationship. The U.S. doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with Iran, so it's more difficult. So, yeah, I think that this administration is very committed to diplomacy, and part of it is political in the sense that it wants to distinguish itself from the Trump administration to show that it really cares about engaging with its partners and its allies. It wants to restore alliances. That's been a big catchphrase from the administration. But certainly the Afghanistan withdrawal dealt a blow to those efforts just because it, at least in the short term, it alienated a number of key NATO partners that thought that the administration wasn't properly consulting with them as they were planning the withdrawal. And they thought that the U.S. was really reacted badly and didn't do enough to help other embassies of other NATO countries in Kabul with security issues and evacuation issues. So there was a blow right there. But no, I do see a difference with the previous administration that this emphasis on diplomacy is there in ways that it hadn't been previously, particularly in terms of a willingness to engage with or to try to engage with rivals and competitors. So I see that as a good thing. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your response. Interesting one.
That brings us to the end of this really fascinating interactive session. I was initially thinking we would end about half an hour early, but Michael, we've had a lot of questions and comments on the chat box, and you've been very patient in answering all of them. I can't thank you enough for all the work. In fact, I think a lot of the audience here doesn't know the amount of work Michael has put in establishing the school, in actually framing the syllabus, as well as giving us a lot of ideas. So Michael is an integral part of the school and the university family. So I want to thank you, Michael, for taking out time so early in the day. And of course, we'll remain in touch and look forward to working with you on many other issues in the future. We'll continue to stay in touch, and I want to thank you. And of course, I want to also mention that we have 3 interesting talks lined up, and this was the first one of them, where Michael's given us a very fascinating American perspective or a world view. Tomorrow, of course, we have Ambassador Venkatesh Verma, who is returned from Moscow as the Indian ambassador, giving us a perspective on Russia, followed by day after tomorrow, where we have General S.L. Narasimhan, sir, who's a former defense attaché in Beijing, also give us a perspective from China's point of view. So there are 3 interesting talks lined up. All of you are welcome to come by and attend. We've created this platform for our students, we don't want to restrict anyone. We want people to come in. We want them to engage in a robust interaction, and we want them to benefit from this opportunity of interacting with eminent experts like Michael and the other 2 who are following suit. Thank you once again to every one of you for your constant support. and for waiting so patiently through the last 2 hours and listening to all of our interactions. Michael, once again, thank you so much. And I leave everyone now with these final words. Michael, would you want to say anything?
Well, just to say thank you all, and indeed, it's been such a great experience to be involved in the this board to help shape the curriculum and syllabus of the school. And the reward for me is seeing the students, and especially seeing how bright they are and how curious they are, and the great questions that you all had, which is really terrific. That's my just reward. So it's terrific. It was great to do this. I did leave my email address in the chat. If anyone had any follow-up queries, you could feel free to reach out. But I thank Venkat for organizing this, and I thank Dr. Patel for his chair and his great questions. And I look forward to staying in touch. And I hope that at some point in the near future, I could have another engagement with you all, but in person. Hopefully that time will come soon enough. So for that, thank you all for sticking around this long. And I wish you a good evening, and stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Michael. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Have a nice evening. See you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye. Kritika, we can, I think, meet in the other link, no? IR link.
So can we meet after 10 minutes?
Yeah.
10
We'll
minutes.
meet at 6. We'll meet at 6.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Venkat, thank you for inviting me for this.
Yeah,
this
thank you, Jaideep. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, that was a fascinating, really tutorial, if I may say. Well, it sort of, put things in perspective. And, I think we have much in common, United States, where I studied. And, the questions I asked, because at this point of time, I'm sort of, looking at irregular war initiatives, which I think is, gaining in ground in both the countries. The question I asked was a very simple one, but,
Yeah.
what happened in Northeast with this insurgency movements, attacks, etc. also needs
In
to be
fact,
sort of.
Jaideep, I would, I think it will be great for you to also join us for the China talk.
Yes,
Because
I know General Narasimhan, and it'd be great if you can just kindly send me
absolutely.
both the links for tomorrow if I'm free. I mean,
Yeah.
today I just happen to be free because I gave a talk in the CTTC, that international conference, which is just that one which has just got concluded. I
Yeah.
had to give a talk on Northeast, but thankfully, and I got over. I was really looking forward to this one, and I thought it was very fruitful. So
Yeah.
really,
Thank
really,
you.
all thanks to you. And at some point of time, we need to sort of resurrect what we had discussed,
Yeah.
and maybe a joint paper or something like that. And
Absolutely. We will.
absolutely,
We can definitely collaborate on that, and hopefully you will also join us in one of the platforms, and you can actually speak to our students, share your experiences.
certainly. I mean, yeah, if it has a bearing on Northeast or Bangladesh, or maybe Myanmar, as it sort of pans out now, Myanmar is becoming a little
Yeah.
bit of a
Yeah.
problem. Today,
Absolutely.
today we had but it was really top generals and ambassadors and secretaries. But still, I would be very happy to talk to your students as well. I mean,
Yeah.
no. Just let me know. Give me a window of a few days, so I'll
Yeah.
be prepared. If it is not a
So one,
PowerPoint presentation, it could be just a lecture or something like that.
yeah. One of the things we do, Jaideep, is actually try to align it to the syllabus that is running simultaneously. So,
Understood. Yes.
so I'm sure that the neighborhood is something we'll deal with next semester,
Okay.
starting from February. So I'm sure that we will get to an opportunity where we'll discuss Myanmar, we'll discuss Bangladesh, we'll discuss the Northeast more closely. So I'll
Yeah.
involve you there.
Absolutely. I'm your man. I mean,
Yeah.
thank you so much for remembering me. And
Thank you.
I of course, been very busy, giving lectures. Despite COVID, I had to go to Wellington for the DSSE, this thing. And there was, online, discussions with some think tanks in United States as well.
Right.
And today, of course, this Global Council for Counterterrorism, a 6-day seminar. So I was like, but at 3:45, I was looking at the time. I said, let's do it.
Yeah.
But I'm going back. The takeaway was really pleasing. I think
Yeah,
this very
yeah. No,
important.
actually, also Michael, I had specifically requested Michael to speak to the students. more
Yes,
than
I
us.
can understand that. Yes,
Yeah,
I can
which
understand
is
that.
why
But
he also which is why he also laid emphasis on the basics. So I'm
yes,
sure
yes.
that if I had told him this is a much wider, because ultimately our students need to benefit. That's the
Yeah,
objective.
yeah. But Dr. Venkatesh, I consider myself to be a student of
Yeah,
security as well.
yeah, that's true. That's
In
true.
fact,
We are
when
all
somebody says expert, I said certainly not. I know only about, you know, 10% of what
yeah.
I speak about, and
Absolutely.
so there's
I'll of course WhatsApp you the poster and the link for tomorrow and day after.
and the day after tomorrow. I would rather
Yeah.
actually, General Narasimhan, when he was the commandant of the Army War College, he invited me to give a talk to the High Command. That
Right.
was the last time I met him, and then of course, my concept of line of amity, I had not included him, but the Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran and others, GK Pillai,
Yeah.
and co-commanders and army commanders. But point is that he knows me very well. He was a co-commander of 3 Corps in
Yeah.
Dimapur.
Yeah.
So he knows me well. So it'll be great to listen
And
to him.
Ambassador Venkatesh Verma is speaking for one of the first times after returning from Moscow.
Is it the same time at 3:45, or do you have a different time?
So both those talks are happening at 3:15.
3:15. That's all
Yeah.
right. I'll find some time. I'm a little busy now advising the government here also. But point
Sure.
is that, one has to make one's bread and butter. But, I don't. And I'm writing furiously. I've got a column for First Post, by the way.
Right.
And so I have to write a weekly piece on security and strategy.
Right.
And maybe at some point of time, we can do a little joint,
Absolutely.
endeavor to write
Absolutely. No,
strategically.
we look forward to doing that. I think we should
Yeah,
get
yeah,
together.
yeah, yeah,
Definitely,
yeah.
we'll do that. And thank
Absolutely.
you so much, Jaideep, for your support. And if you
No,
have
no, no,
any
no. I should be
ideas,
thanking you for remembering me and including me in this very interesting, conversation and interaction.
thank you.
I look
Thank
forward to the link, and then we'll take it from there. And maybe once you're free, we can write something together. Let me
Absolutely,
know.
absolutely. We'll stay in touch on WhatsApp. Thank you.
Right, 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 right,
Thank
Dr. Vink.
you. Have a great evening, Jaideep. Thank you,
You too, you
everyone.
too,
Please
you
take
too,
care.
you too,
Thank
you
you.
too. Take care.